Good morning, everyone. We are from Group 6 and we would like to present about American realism. Our group consists of Laura Ismadiwanti and Nasafa Septara Herjo. In this presentation, we would like to discuss about 6 materials, and the first is origin of realism, the second is defining realism, the third is key influences, the fourth is characteristics, the fifth is figures in realism, and the last is impacts of realism. The origin of realism. Realism began in late 1800s but really became popular in the 19th century, and it was from the beginning of Civil War to the beginning of World War I. Realism began as a reaction to and a rejection of Romanticism, with its emphasis on emotion, imagination, and the individual. As the United States grew rapidly after the Civil War, the increasing rates of democracy and literacy, the rapid growth in industrialism and urbanization, an expanding population base due to immigration, and a relative rise in middle-class affluence provided a fertile literary environment for readers interested in understanding this rapid shift in culture.
Next, defining realism. Realism became a movement in literary and visual art. Realism generally refers to realistic portrayals of subject matter and content. It prefers to depict everyday situations and be more truthful to social realities. In literature, writers use realism as a literary technique to describe story elements such as setting, characters, themes, etc., without using elaborate imagery or figurative language such as similes and metaphors. The purpose of realism is to emphasize the reality and morality that is usually relativistic and intrinsic for the people as well as the society. Realism, often referring to social class, represented everyday American lifestyle. Realist. Realist writers exposed political corruption, economic inequity, business deception, the exploitation of labor, women's rights problems, and racial inequity. Realists often described the relationship between the economic transformation of America and its moral condition. Key influences of realism. The first one is the Civil War. The Civil War was a major cause of the rise of realism in America. The 4-year conflict destroyed cities, industries, and lives, and also left bitter memories and economic desolation in the South. The second one is advances in technology. Technological advances also contributed to the rise of realism in America. Photography allowed people to see real, sometimes dismaying images of war and poverty. Telephones and coast-to-coast railways allowed more people than ever to hear about events that affected the nations. The third one is advances in science and education. Advances in psychology, biology, and geology contradicted long-held beliefs about the nature and humans, the world, and the universe. More people, especially women, minorities, and the poor, had access to an education and learned to read. Newspapers and the new mass circulation magazines were widely read. The last one is social changes. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution outlawing slavery was ratified. Industrialization led to overpopulation and poverty in the cities. The agrarian economy of the South was devastated by the war and by the loss of slave labor. Many newly freed slaves and other Southerners moved to northern cities looking for work.
The next material is about characteristics of realism literature. First, realistic authors convey the reality of life. The characters reflect ordinary people in everyday life, like struggling to overcome the difficulties of war, family, natural disasters, and human weaknesses. The next is transparent language. One big innovation of realist literature was the use of simple, transparent language. For example, Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was revolutionary in its use of ordinary, spoken language, including slang and ungrammatical usage, in the narration of a tale. The next characteristic is use real dialects of the area. The characters are marked by their adherence to the old ways by dialect and by particular personality traits central to the region. Next is realism literature shows importance in depicting social class. Class is a huge deal in realist literature. Middle class is always going to be more prevalent than the upper class in realist literature. The realists were interested in writing about people they knew and people who were like them. And in the case of American writers, those were in the middle class. And the last is omniscient narrator. The author became masters at psychological characterization, detailed description of everyday life in realistic settings, and dialogue that captures the idioms of natural human speech.
Next, we have prominent figures in realism. Mark Twain, Samuel Langhorne Clemens, 1835 until 1910, or known by his pen name Mark Twain, was American writer, humorist, entrepreneur, publisher, and lecturer. Twain could be considered as the most well-known realistic novelist. His books, Life on the Mississippi and The Adventure of Tom Sawyer, are both amazing. In the early of 19th century, American writers tend to be too flowery, sentimental, or ostentatious, partially because they were still trying to prove that they could write as elegantly as the English. Twain's style, based on vigorous, realistic, colloquial American speech, gave American writers a new appreciation of their national voice. Twain was the first major author to come from the interior of the country, and he captured its distinctive, humorous slang and iconoclasm, or the social belief in the importance of the destruction of icons and other images or monuments, most frequently for religious or political reasons. Next, we have local colorist writer. What sets the colorists apart is their self-conscious and exclusive interest in rendering a given location and their scrupulously factual and realistic technique. In 19th century, women writers formed their own networks of moral support and influence, as their letters show. Women made up the major audience for fiction, and many women wrote popular novels, poems, and humorous pieces. All regions of the country celebrated themselves in writing influenced by local color. Some of it included social protest, especially toward at the end of the century, when social inequality and economic hardship were particularly pressing issues. For local colorists, we have Theodora Sarah Ornate Jewett, or also known as Sarah Jewett, September 3rd, 1849 until June 24th, 1909, was an American novelist, short story writer, and poet. Jovette's originality, exact observation of her main characters and setting, and sensitive style are best seen in her fine story The White Heron in Country of the Pointed First in 1896. In The White Heron, and especially in The Country of Pointed First, Jewett employed the flexible narrative structure of the sketch and the short story to create sensitive, realistic depictions of specific characters, customs, and places. The genre of sketch, which less formal than a novel and less dependent on traditional conventions of plotting and structure, enabled her to experiment with narrative form to compelling effect.
The next figure is Henry James Owen. He was born in April 15, 1843 and died in February 28, 1916. He was an American author who became a British subject in the last year of his life. He was known as father of American psychological realism. His greatest work is Daisy Miller. It is a story about a young American girl's refusal to follow the status quo in Europe. Realism is evident throughout the story's pages, and Henry James demonstrates this concept through his focus on characters as individuals and their experiences in middle and upper class society, their free will to make their own choices, and what goes through the minds of those characters in the story. The next features of American realism is William Dean Howells. He was born in March 1st, 1837 and died in May 11, 1920. He was an American realist novelist, literary critic, and playwright. He was the first major author to introduce America to their style of realism. His book that portrays realism is A Modern Instance. It was his first major novel, and it told the story of a couple whose marriage was impossible to mend and eventually ended in divorce. This novel portrays realism because its plot is relatable and is common in everyday lives.
Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, February 12, 1809 until April 15, 1865, was American statesman and lawyer who served as the 16th President of the United States from 1861 to 1865. Lincoln led the nation through the American Civil War, the country's greatest moral, constitutional, and political crisis. Slavery was not the only trial Lincoln had to deal with. Lincoln had to witness his beloved American people fight against each other in which there was massive bloodshed. An example of this is the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Lincoln witnessed the horror of this battle and gave a speech afterwards. This was no ordinary speech. This speech would go on to be known as Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Lincoln did not write a lengthy speech. He was straight and to the point. He stated the reality of what had happened in the war, but inspired hope and a sense of patriotism by saying that we could endure.
The next figure is Walt Whitman. He was born in May 31st, 1819 and died in March 26, 1892. He was one of the great American poets of the 19th and 20th centuries. His poem, Song of Myself, portrays realism within the poem. From the style of writing of Whitman in Song of Myself, there is a sense of realism within the poem. There is a symbiotic relationship between poet and the society. As it is written at the time right after American Civil War, there are certain aspects of the poems that could be especially related to that period of time. Another thing to point out is that Whitman chose to write in free verse. One of the characteristics of transition writers is experience with new poetic techniques such as free verse and slang rhyme. Song of Myself contains lengthy list of characters involved in everyday activities such as farmers, claim diggers, carpenters, trappers, blacksmiths, and etc. Whitman, a resident of New York City, also references the darker realities of urban life such as contagious disease, mental illness, and suicide.
Next, impacts of realism. Realism addressed as a whole mostly middle and lower class lifestyles. Realism is culture over nature and a representation of society and its norms, religiously and politically in involving real-life situations and government. It also expressed the psychological impacts of the war and real-life situation in other aspects of life. The second one is realism contributed to the reunification of the country after the Civil War. The third one is realism helped build a national identity. And the last one is realism contributed to the narrative of unified nationhood that late 19th century America sought to construct. That's all from us. Thank you and have a nice day, everyone.